Okay, now if I can pick up the foundations that I've laid and build on that. So if you turn to the handout, appeal to liturgical imagination, point 2. The challenge for us is has 2 parts to it. First of all, to see the picture that the preacher is painting for us in Hebrews. Not to abstract it, not to work it out rationally or intellectually, but to see the picture that the author of Hebrews is painting for us and his congregation. And then secondly, in our own preaching, to do something similar, to paint a similar, relevant, winsome picture for our people. And that involves seeing, and we were talking about narrative, seeing the connection between the story of Israel and God's dealings with Israel, Old Testament, that story, and our story. Now, our story has 2 sides to it. The story of the church, the story of my congregation, my story as a member of the congregation. Right? So there's an analogy that's being drawn here all the time. The story of God's dealings with his people in the Old Testament, the story of God's dealings with, not the church generally, that could be very abstract, but the story of God's dealings with you, my congregation, and me as part of this congregation. 2 stories. And to see what God now says, God spoke, and the most important part of the story of the Old Testament is the main character is invisible. Who's the main character? God. And to make sense of the story, you need to focus on what God says. You can only make sense of what happens, what God does, and what people do in the light of what God says, the oracles of God, the spoken words of God. So, and then to see then these 2 stories, there's the story of my congregation, the story of Israel, to see the connections between the 2, and to show people what God now says to them through the Old Testament. Because the same God who spoke that word there, is speaking this word to his people now. The same God who said to David through a prophet, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, is speaking that word to this congregation here and now. Same God, same speaking, but different people. And yet it's the same people, because the people of Israel are our spiritual ancestors. Our story is a continuation of their story. So it means seeing how the divine service then in the New Testament resembles and yet differs from the divine service in the Old Testament. Now, can we just stop there a minute? And this is not always evident in many modern theologies of the Old Testament, is the centrality of the tabernacle, temple, and the divine service. The service of God is the focus, from a human point of view, of God's dealings with his people and the people's interaction with God. What's the constant? Is either people fit in with God, with what God gives them in the divine service, or they construct their own service of God. But this lies at the centre of the Old Testament, but also lies at the centre of the story of the New Testament. What is the core of what God gave to his people at Mount Sinai? Not just the 10 Commandments, but the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the daily services. That's the content of the covenant. What's the content of the new covenant? Where did Jesus establish the new covenant? How did he establish the new covenant? The Last Supper. And with the Last Supper, he establishes the divine service in the church. Now, what's going to be the big difference between, okay, so there's going to be resemblances between Old Testament service, New Testament service, and you need to be very clear on the nature of them. What's going to be the big difference between the divine service, Old Testament, divine service, New Testament?
No more sacrifice?
Well, depends. You've got to define what sacrifice is. And that's one of the most slippery terms imaginable. Do you know that in the Old Testament and New Testament there's no general concept of sacrifice? But we talk as if there is. You talked as if there was. Yeah?
I think the difference is all in the blood.
Blood? There was blood in the Old Testament.
Yes, but this is a better blood. The blood.
This is the better blood, but you touch on what's different, but it's not yet the core of it. Whose blood is it?
Jesus.
The blood of Jesus. What's the big difference between Old Testament and New Testament?
It's human blood.
It's partly that. It's the presence of
Jesus.
the crucified, risen Lord Jesus. So it has to do with the incarnation. It has to do with the whole story of Jesus' life, from his conception through to his exaltation. The big difference is the presence of Jesus as high priest and as victim. He is both victim and priest, hence the blood is part of it, but he's also there as high priest. So you see there were high priests in the Old Covenant, but we have a high priest with a difference. There was sacrifices, there was blood in the Old Testament, body of animals, which were burnt or eaten, blood which atoned for sin, but blood which was never drunk. New Covenant, we drink the blood of the victim. But there's also a continuity and discontinuity. So you have a sanctuary, a temple in Old Testament, tabernacle, and then temple. Do we have a temple in the New Testament?
In heaven.
Temple in heaven, but also a church generally. Bring it as concretely down to earth as possible. That's right. Not you. Jesus is the temple of the living God. And where's Jesus? He's both in heaven and he is on earth. And so concretely, as far as you want to see the house of the living God, the temple of the living God, do you see it?
On the altar.
No. The altar is in the house, is in the temple. The congregation. The congregation is the house of God, the temple of God. It's a temple not made by hands, but it's a temple made out of flesh, but a temple made of human bodies, if you like to put it that way. No. Now I'd like to introduce something which is very old-fashioned, but it's something that has been lost because of these changes that have occurred, broad changes, has basically been lost in the church, but was there right from the beginning. It's in Old Testament, New Testament, early church, and it's essential to our classical Lutheran tradition. And that's the understanding of typology and the typological understanding of the Old Testament. Now, I'll define typology in due course, but the author to the Hebrews uses typology to paint a picture and to communicate a vision of the congregation's involvement together with Jesus in the divine service. So typology has to do with imagery, picture language, and getting you to see how what was here shows us what was here at that time and at that place, shows us what is now going on at the present, at this time and in this place, and also how what is happening here on earth how what is happening in heaven shows us what is happening on earth. So typology has to do with analogy, comparison. And I want to unpack that, because if you're really going to get your head around, or you get your eyes around what Hebrews is saying, you need to understand the way Hebrews speaks typically, using types. Let's go to the central passage in Hebrews where this is stated. In Exodus chapter 25 verse 40, something remarkable happens, and we'll come to that, but it's in the middle of a very important section in Exodus. Let me just tell the story of Exodus. Exodus 19, the people of Israel come to Mount Sinai. They're camped at the foot of the mountain, and Moses goes up, is called by God up to the mountain, and God tells Moses what he intends to do with his people. He wants to make his people a holy, priestly nation, a holy kingdom, and a holy people, a priestly kingdom, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. That's his purpose. Priestly, holy people. That's his intention. And then you have the story of how God appears to his people in a cloud. The glory of God appears hidden in a cloud on top of Mount Sinai, and the people get ready for the theophany. Okay, then you have chapter 20 through to 23. You have God's appearance to them, not visibly, but through his spoken word, to the whole congregation of Israel, and he speaks the 10 commandments to them. So you have the Decalogue. And then you have the exchange between Moses and the people. The people can't take it, it's too terrifying, so they appoint Moses as their mediator. So Moses then is, and this is accordance with God's will, because that's already been touched on, Moses is officially appointed by the people. God had appointed him as a mediator. Now the people appoint him as their mediator at the end of chapter 20. And then you get some additional laws that are given by God to Moses, what scholars call the covenant code. It's a code of God's directions them on how to live as a holy people on their journey to the promised land. Then chapter 24, now let me just get that right. I should have written that down. Chapter 24 tells the story of how God called Moses to the top of the mountain, and then calls him top of the mountain, and then Moses goes to tells the people what God requires of them at the bottom of the mountain, and then Moses builds an altar and he sacrifices animals. Don't tell the whole story, but he sprinkles the blood of those sacrificed animals over all the people. Now, usually people say by doing this he seals the covenant, but that's not, strictly speaking, accurate. What Moses does by sprinkling the people with the blood of the sacrificed people is that he cleanses them from sin, and more importantly, consecrates them as what kind of people? A holy, priestly people. A holy people, a kingdom of priests. So the whole nation is to be holy. The whole nation has access to God. The whole nation is to serve God as his priestly, holy people. Now, for them to do that, they need a tabernacle, and they need the divine service. And you have Moses then goes on top of the mountain I know this is, there's a meal then. I won't tell the whole story. I'll fill that in a little bit later. But then what's important is here. And on top of Mount Sinai, God gives 7 speeches, 7 words to Moses. The first speech is the most important one. In this speech, God gives them the tabernacle, and God gives them the priesthood, and God gives them the divine service and everything that was necessary for the service. On top of the mountain, to Moses. This is the center, the core of the book of Exodus. And this is the core of God's revelation to Moses. You have the revelation to the people, 10 commandments. This is the core of his revelation to Moses. Notice, what does it consist of? The tabernacle, the place of worship, the priests, and then the divine service, the daily service. Okay. Now, in the middle of this here, you have this verse. Can you go, first of all, just to the English? Can we go to Exodus 25, verse 40? Where we read, and see that you make them, that's all the things in connection with the divine service, but particularly with the lampstand and the Holy of Holies, and see that you make them after the pattern, Tavnith, which is the model for them, which is being shown you on the mountain. Now, there's a different twist to that in the Septuagint. And this is what we have then quoted in Exodus. You can look at the Hebrew there, the Greek there yourself. Not all of you got Greek, so I won't spend a great deal of time. But this is the literal translation from Hebrews 8, verse 5. Such priests, that's Old Testament priests, perform the service, they perform the daily service, at or with a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. As Moses, who was about to erect the tent, was instructed in an oracle by God, the term there means by a spoken speech of God, for he said that God said, see, you shall make or do everything according to the type shown you on the mountain. Now, notice the deliberate ambiguity here, the two senses. God says, look at this. So he shows Moses a model of what he is to make. So he says, look at this model. If you think of an architect's model, but it's not an architect's model. This is the real thing that he's to copy here on earth. The heavenly real thing that is to copy here. So look at this, see this. So the command to see, you shall make everything according to the model that I show you here in heaven. So the tabernacle is to be made in such a way that it copies in some way, in earthly terms, it copies the heavenly things, the heavenly realities. Now, but it's not only the tabernacle. Poiais doesn't just mean to make, but it also means to do. To do everything which happens in the tabernacle, in the divine service, according to what is shown to you by me on the mountain. Do you get the basic sense of that? So it's show and tell. God's show and tell to Moses to equip him to build the tabernacle, but not just to build the tabernacle, but then to perform the divine service in the tabernacle. Now, notice here, the basic reality is that the earthly sanctuary is meant to mirror heaven. And what happens in the earthly sanctuary, the tabernacle, is meant to mirror what is going on in heaven. So you get a correspondence, some kind of a correspondence with earth and heaven. The accent here is not just on what God says, but on what God shows Moses. We have here an understanding of Moses as a visionary prophet who sees what God's word says. God shows him what he is saying. I've given you that little bit of Greek there. Now, this is the foundation then, if you like, for a typological understanding of the worship of God in the Old Testament and the worship of God in the New Testament. Now, typology has to do with the study of similarities and analogies. So, what God does in the Old Testament is similar to what God is doing in the New Covenant. What God is saying to Moses and his people in the Old Covenant is similar to what he is saying in the New Covenant. So there's similarities. They're not the same. There's comparisons, analogies, similarities between, not just a similarity between earth and heaven, but also similarities between Old Covenant, New Covenant. Can you see the typology works in two ways? It goes up, down, heaven, earth, but then also here now, going into the present, what happens now is similar to what happened then. Or to look forward, what Moses does and what the priests do and what the Israelites do in the daily services is similar and is meant to point to what Jesus will do as high priest in the New Covenant. Now notice this is getting you to exercise your imagination, to see what's going on. Now let me give you the basic words that I used to describe this reality, this way of reading the Old Testament, and particularly reading the parts of the Old Testament that deal with the divine service. There's that whole big liturgical slab of material that most people overlook, which is the center of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, for any Jew, is the main part of the Bible, and the center of the Pentateuch is all that ritual material from Exodus chapter 20 through to Numbers 10. And at the heart of that lies the book of Leviticus, which is all to do with ritual, ceremonial law. And we say Jesus has abolished that. That's irrelevant to us. Rubbish. That's when it comes to worship, that's some of the most important part of the Old Testament. But you need to understand it and interpret it and read it and see it in terms of analogy, comparison, which means that we are dealing with typology. Now, what do we mean by typology? Let me explain that, the way it's used. First of all, the word typology comes from typos. Everybody in the ancient world would have known when you talked about typos, because it's the stamp that was made of a die on a coin. I don't have any coins here. What?
A blanchet.
A blanchet, yes, that's the modern one. So the blanchet, but with the ancient term was the typos, which means to hit. It comes from being hit. So it's the stamp that produces the image on a coin. So you have the obverse of the stamp is what comes on the coin. You have the stamp, and then you have what's produced by the stamp. We have rubber stamps. Okay, you have the master stamp that produces an image then on paper. Even more commonly than the picture of a coin. So you have the stamp on the coin, which produces the image on the coin. You have this rubber stamp, which then produces the copy on a piece of paper. The third analogy is to use, it was every person in the ancient world who was a free person and had a bank balance would not wear a ring like this, but would wear a signet ring. And the signet ring, you had your own personal seal that was engraved. Now, if you wanted to sign a legal document, it would be wax would be used, and then you would stamp the wax with your signet ring. You would seal every letter, every document with a stamp of your signet ring. So that's equivalent to, in modern terms, to signing your signature. But okay, do you get the basic picture? There's two things. There's the stamp, if I can use that, stamp or punch. And then you have the impress of the punch. Now, they're not exactly the same, but they correspond because it's the obverse of one. So typology has to do with that correspondence. Most literally, that's the picture that's used. Any questions on that? And then the opposite, so you have the stamp, if I can use that term. You understand what I'm talking about, stamp? That's the master die. This is the type, and that produces the antitypos, which is the impression that it makes. Now, what that stamp, the impress of the stamp on wax or on metal or on a piece of paper. So you have type and antitype. Have you heard of that term, antitype? A similar way of thinking is prototype, which is the original, and then you have a copy of a prototype. Prototype means the original thing, and then you have the copy, which is made from a prototype. Antitypos is the copy, the impression that's made by the typos, the type. Yes?
You used a delightful example in Leviticus where you speak of the grain offerings were being required to have salt.
Yes.
And then your application is in Acts 1:4, where the Greek has Jesus is swapping salt with his disciples.
Yes.
But otherwise, the English doesn't translate it that way.
Yes, that's Acts 1 verse 4. Yeah. Look, you see it once you get it, you can see it everywhere. It's not just this doesn't just work from Old Testament, New Testament, but it gets everywhere within Old Testament and New Testament. So the Exodus from Egypt is a type of the return of Israel from Babylon. So type, antitype works all the time. But it's an imaginative, visual way of thinking. You've got to see the picture of what the picture of the Exodus. In what way is the return from Babylon similar and yet different from to the Exodus from Egypt? So always where you have this typology, you get similarity and dissimilarity. It's never the same. And a lot of people have got it wrong when they say it only deals with, it's exactly the same. Is the Exodus from, is the return from Babylon exactly the same as the return from? No. Why? Because they had no Moses. Who brought the Israelites back from Babylon? You get it in the book of Isaiah. Strangely, it wasn't Moses that was responsible for their return from captivity, but a pagan King Cyrus. You know all about that. Yeah.
Is then the
as you speak of the idea of there's similarity and dissimilarity, is the similarity to be found for the most part in the act of the type, i.e. the thing God does, or is it not necessarily limited to that? Because you think of deliverance in both of those.
In some cases, the similarity is similarity of action. Other cases, it's similarity of persons. Other cases, it's similarity of objects. It can be a whole range. Or it could be similarity of institutions. So, kingship in Israel is a type of Christ's kingship. Person, you have the high priest in the Old Testament. Jesus as high priest is similar to the high priest in the New Testament. The Holy of Holies in the Old Testament is similar to heaven. New Testament. But it's also different. You see, there's always similarities and yet differences, and you've got to see, to nail it down exactly, you've got to see both the similarities and the dissimilarities. Usually the dissimilarity is not completely different, but it completes the picture. You get the full picture. So Jesus is high priest, and then you get the victim, the daily lamb that's sacrificed. Now, New Covenant, the typology gets rather funny because Jesus is not only a priest, but he's high priest, but he's also the Lamb of God, the victim. But that sort of messes with the literal understanding of it, the original understanding of it. Jesus is not only the anointed king, descendant of David, but he's also the anointed high priest. So he's similar to the high priest, but he's also similar to David, and yet he exceeds. He is the king par excellence. He is the priest par excellence. He is the far greater priest. He's the far greater king. Hence you get that way of thinking that I touched on. Hebrews always doesn't see discontinuities, but continuities. The good things in the Old Testament are types of the better things, the more perfect things in the New Testament. I'm trying to get you to think typologically. Now, the third term that's used for to describe this way of not so much thinking, but this way of imagining, this way of seeing, is hypodeigma. Deiknumi is to show. Hypodeigma is to show you the copy of something that's made from another model or a picture. So let's say, for example, none of you have seen Sydney Harbour Bridge. I could then say, give you a scale model of it to show you what it's like. Right? So that's a hypodeigma. It's a model, it's a copy of the bridge, but it's not the same as the bridge. So the tabernacle was a copy of stuff that Moses saw in heaven itself. Hypodeigma. But notice the word deiknumi lies behind that, which is to show, showing and telling. The accent on seeing, the visual aspect of this. Lastly, Hebrews says, the priests perform the service at the copy, there you get the copy, and the shadow of the heavenly things. You have the copy of the heavenly things, hypodeigma, and then you have the shadow of the heavenly things. Now, don't try and get the concept here, but get the picture. Okay, and the picture is of a body, human body, with the sun behind it. What happens when you're out in the sun? What does when you have the sun behind you? You have a shadow. And the shadow is real. It shows you, let's say, for example, you had the side vision, and you couldn't see a person coming. The sun's behind you, but you know somebody's coming. Why? Because the shadow shows that a body is coming. Okay? A shadow is real, and yet it's only a... What is it? It's a foreshadowing. We use the term foreshadowing of what's to come. A very concrete picture. Now, if you like, what happens there is that instead of seeing the full body with all its details, the shadow shows you what? The outline of the body. But what you need to do, what's the problem with the shadow, is that you can see what's coming, but you can't see the whole picture.
Leaves the mystery.
It leaves a mystery, exactly. The Old Testament foreshadows the New Testament. Can you understand that language then? So the high priest foreshadows Jesus. The daily service in the Old Testament foreshadows the divine service, etc. So you have foreshadowing. So 3 key terms: type, stamp; antitype, the impression made by a stamp; hypodigma, copy, model; and then skia, which is the shadow made by a body. Let's leave shadows and types and let's go to the realities.